Okay, what I wanted to do today, I like to keep these talks informal, and this is one of my favorite topics, and I kept adding slides, which is a mistake. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I'm going to try to make it 35 minutes or so we can have time to talk, but this topic especially is sort of hard for me that way. So I will do my best, but feel free to break in. I think that, because I guess everybody else might appreciate that too. And what I want to talk about is reconciliation ecology. It's my favorite word these days, and I must admit my wife also really loves it, and I'm working on reconciliation. She's deeply involved in her local Lutheran church, and reconciliation's a great word for them too. So the fact I can apply it to fish makes it all the better. And the basic ecological problem I'm talking about is competition. That's competition between people and fish for water. And that's why we need reconciliation, because we've got this very intense competition going on. And you're well aware, of course, that most of the water falls up in Northern California. The big water demand's down in the southern San Joaquin Valley in Southern California, as well as in the Bay Area. So there's this disconnect between where the water originates and where the big demand is. So we've created this amazing hydrologic system to deliver water from one part of the state to the next. Again, you're all well aware of that. But the fish are losing in this. What's going on right now? The fish are definitely losing. The population of California is growing. The populations of fish are going down. And as I'll point out, we have a remarkable variety of fish in California. And these are species that, something like the golden trout, people are well aware of, or that little Chinook salmon there. But others, like the Sacramento perch, another species I'm working on right now, are much less well known. And in fact, about 80% of our fish are found only in the California region. In other words, this is a California issue. If we want these fish around in the future, it's up to us. There's no other refuge in some other state or some other river system. These are fish that are living mostly in California. So reconciliation is again, what I really want to talk about. And you can argue that there are three basic approaches to conservation: reservation, restoration, and reconciliation. This is Michael Rosenzweig's words. Reservation is where you set something aside and go, not really walk away, but put a fence around it and try to keep it as pristine as possible. Restoration is where you try to bring something back to a more natural condition, usually with the model being some pristine environment. And what you realize when you think about those as major strategies for conservation is that they really encompass very small pieces of land, very small parts of the landscape. And especially it's a problem with streams which run through wide swatches of landscape. So that's why I like to talk about reconciliation, because it deals with reality. And reconciliation, by the standard dictionary definition, is the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. That's why, again, my wife likes it so much, because her Lutheran church is very much into reconciling their beliefs with that of other religions. So when you talk about excuse me, reconciliation ecology, this is Michael Rosenzweig at University of Arizona's idea. It said, it's the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve diversity in places where people live, work, and play. In other words, finding places for all the critters that we appreciate, including fish, in human-dominated landscapes. That's really where we are right now. There's no place on Earth that's not heavily influenced by humans. And I think that's the reality we have to live with. We recognize we no longer have really pristine systems anymore. Let's work with the systems we have and do as much as we can for the native organisms. Otherwise, we're going to lose them. And this is why we need reconciliation ecology, of course, is that most rivers are dammed or highly modified in California, and the fish especially don't have a place to go. A bird can fly from one place to another, maybe find a new place. The fish, if once they're trapped above or below a dam under altered conditions, they can't move. So we really have a responsibility for our fish. If we want them around, we've got to figure out ways to make that happen. And we also need it because we're constantly in the crisis management mode. This drought really brought it forth. We're not out of the drought yet, but during the drought, we found that whenever there was a choice to be made between providing water for fish or people, the fish would lose. There were all kinds of change orders put out by the State Water Resources Control Board that took environmental water away from the environment and put it in gave it to farmers or the cities. And that's what we have to, if we're going to do reconciliation, we have to get away from that. We have to make environmental flows on par with flows for other purposes. And this is reflected in the fish. Right now, 83% of our fish are extinct or declining. Another way to look at this is, again, this is data that I've been collecting over the years. I just finished a report for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's now posted online on their website on fish species of special concern. And these are species that are on a trajectory to being endangered species that could be listed in the not too distant future if present trends continue. There are 63 species on that list. And now the department's accepted the report. That's an official designation these species have. An additional 30 species are already listed under the state and federal Endangered Species Acts. So 90 of the 122 extant species, and there are 7 that are extinct, 90 of these species are in serious trouble. So that tells you that if we want these fish around in the future, and this includes not just obscure fish like pupfish, but important fish like salmon, we have to do something. Another way to look at it is, I've done periodic assessments of the status of the fish fauna in California. When the first one I did was in 1975, shortly after I moved to the state. And his maps, this 1975 map shows everything that's green is really good. But most of the fish have status scores that are really high. This is the way it looks today. That all that green is shifted to yellow, which is fairly low status scores, and a bunch of red ones. The Colorado River's been in bad shape for a long time. But it tells you this has been a very rapid change. And again, it reflects a very rapid change in the California itself, related to the human populations, the expansion of agriculture, and everything else going on in the state. And we see species that are on the verge right now. This is a smelt. It's been listed as an endangered species since 1996. It's on the verge of extinction right now. The listing has not done this fish, it didn't really help the fish that much. And it's quite likely to disappear in the next few years. And that's just an example of one of these species, perhaps the most dramatic because it's in the middle of California's water supply. And the fish, of course, are just our best known aquatic species. This is a graph that comes out of a paper we just published on the status of the freshwater biota of California. And what you notice, what you see here is that mollusks, birds, these are all aquatic-oriented species, plants, all have similar patterns to the fish. Fish are the worst. That's partly because we know the most about them. But in fact, the entire aquatic fauna of California, the native fauna, is in serious trouble. And then we have this yin and yang problem of alien fishes versus native fishes, because our alien fishes, the non-native species, these are the fishes we like. These are the fish we fish for. That's in our reservoirs, our bass, our bluegill, our catfish, as well as our various species of trout, brook trout, for example. And then we have 50 species of non-native fish in California. They dominate many of our habitats. And they're basically, it's sort of the 1-2 punch we face in California. You change the habitat, and that makes it better for these non-native species, which are symbiotic with humans. These are fish that know how to live with us. Our natives did not evolve with humans. These guys more or less did. So these are fully integrated into California's aquatic systems. We have 50 major watersheds in the state. Every one of them has multiple non-native species that are part of the fauna. So again, and this is they have strong interactions with the natives. And then you had climate change on top of all this. This graph here shows you the black bars on the far side there are the likelihood of going extinct or being highly vulnerable to climate change of the native fishes. And what you see, most of our native fishes things are going to get worse for the natives under most climate change scenarios, and the climate change scenarios keep getting worse. Whereas the non-native species in the gray bars are actually going to do fine. Under climate, we're always going to have fish. It's just we're going to have the same fish they have in Minnesota or the eastern U.S. These bass, bluegill, sunfishes, catfishes, and so forth. We're going to have the same fish everybody else has. That's pretty boring to me. I'd really want to keep some of our native fishes around. But they'll thrive while the natives will not. So this gets into reconciliation then. What does a reconciliation approach really mean? One of the places I wanted to talk about is the yellow bypass. For this photograph was taken about a month and a half ago. Again, a major agricultural area and a wildlife area, urban area behind it, and the sky full of geese, wild geese. This is, when you think reconciliation, that's a kind of image to have in your mind. So just to remind you of what, when I talk about reconciliation, ecology, what I'm talking about is the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining these new habitats in human-dominated environments, trying to make fish and wildlife habitats compatible with our own needs. And part of this now is a concept that's coming up increasingly, and you see it being referred to more and more, sort of a key to reconciliation ecology, is accepting the fact that we live in novel ecosystems. That is, ecosystems that have never existed before. These are highly altered. They have a constant human presence. People are part of it. We're part of the ecosystem. No matter where we go, we are part of these ecosystems, and we have to recognize that. And they also contain a lot of non-native species. That means that we have to figure out ways to make the native species, if we want them around, and again, that's the choice we can make. If we want the native species around, we have to figure out how do you make them compatible in these highly altered environments with alien species where we are part of the system. That means the novel ecosystems are integrated systems. They behave just like quote-unquote natural ecosystems, except they contain species from all over the world. And living in environments that never existed before. And that's hard, but it means it's a great place where good science can really walk in. And the way I want to talk about this is to give you 4 examples of where I think reconciliation ecology is at work in California. The Yellow Bypass, Suisun Marsh, Butte Creek, and then Blue Creek up in the Klamath Basin. These are all places I work, and they're all very different from one another. They all have different kinds of problems. What they all have in common is an effort to protect native species in human-dominated environments. The Yellow Bypass, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You drive to the Bay Area, you drive across the Yellow Bypass. If you're lucky, you can drive through it when it's flooding, and then you realize why the bypass exists, when the causeway across the floodplain. Huge colonies of bats that live under that causeway, which gives you a clue. Again, that's reconciliation. That's a major habitat for Mexican free-tailed bats, is under this causeway. Yellow Basin Wildlife Area is located in this area. But it's also a major agricultural area. A lot of rice is grown in the Yellow Bypass and other crops. It turns out it's also a great place for fish. And right now, the big issue is how do you make this bypass, which was a brilliant idea in the 1920s when it was built, for flood management. They didn't think of the management, they thought it was flood control. That's the reason Sacramento doesn't flood, because all those floodwaters go through the bypass. So that's first and foremost the reason the bypass exists. But then it was leased to farmers, and they found it was very great place to farm. Rice and the crops in the upper reaches, pasture and cattle and so forth in the lower reaches. And then it also turned out to be a great place for waterfowl. The farming produced habitat that could flood in the winter, be great for waterfowl. A lot of duck clubs have developed, a lot of hunting. It's very important for hunting. But it's also one of the reasons the Pacific Flyway still exists, is that you have massive areas like the Yellow Bypass, which is a huge area, that flood and provide habitat for waterfowl. Now, we're recently, this is where we talk about it, is the floods, farms, fish, and fowl, making them all compatible. Because we've just been working recently, this is a project largely funded by California Trout, to demonstrate that you can raise salmon on the bypass. If you want salmon to grow fast and learn how to be wild salmon, especially if you're hatchery fish, the bypass is a great place to be. You can flood parts of it artificially. You can put the salmon on there or let them on in through the weir at the upper end. Let them grow like gangbusters. They're bigger and feistier than the hatchery fish. They should go out to sea and survive very well. We're just working on that right now. This is very controversial because we want the bypass to be flooded as long as possible as temperatures are cool. The farmers want you off the bypass, off their fields by March, because that's when they want the fields to dry out so they can plant their crops. And these negotiations are going on right now. It's actually very exciting. What we're finding is that the farmers are in fact very willing to work with everybody. But but they have to make a living off that land at the same time. This is what reconciliation is all about. Figure out how do you make these things compatible. They've already figured out the bird farm connection, because flooded rice fields in the winter are a great place for waterfowl. The connection with salmon is more difficult. But it's going on, and I'm convinced that we'll have a satisfactory resolution to all that in the near future. Partly because I should say, I'm very proud to say my daughter is one of the major negotiators and all that. I have great confidence in her. The other place I like to talk about is Suisun Marsh. This is a place, if you're not familiar with it, when you drive down Highway 80 towards San Francisco, and you pass the Budweiser beer plant, behind the Budweiser beer plant is Suisun Marsh. Or if you take 680 to San Jose, you're skirting the edge of Suisun Marsh. It's the largest brackish marsh on the West Coast, over 480 square kilometers. It's huge. And I've been studying the fish out there since January 1979, sampling out there on a monthly basis. So we've got a huge data set here. But it's mostly private. Mostly there's some public wildlife areas on it, but about 75% of the Suisun Marsh is private duck clubs. So that's where and at the same time, I'll show you the next slide. Oh yeah, this just shows you what the marsh is like. We had the wildlife refuge as part of it, but also all the hunting clubs. And then you'll notice the major Air Force base on one edge, as well as the Fairfield Suisun urban areas. There's wastewater treatment plants that dump into it. It's a highly managed system. It looks great. It really does look great, but it's a highly managed system, and the fish fauna is a mixture, and the invertebrates are mixtures of native and non-native species. This is basically a view of the marsh from one of the wildlife areas there, from the Rush Ranch open space. And what you're seeing here is this really natural-looking marsh. And again, much of the vegetation you see is native, although there's big patches of non-native species. But then you have this urban area in the background that's fringing on the marsh. And one of the important things this marsh does, of course, is protecting Fairfield and Suisun City from sea level rise. They don't really realize that. I don't think the cities properly appreciate that. But this is something that's a major function of this marsh in the future. But it looks great. You know, but if you're like me and you've been working on these marshes for a long time, you realize that there are many aspects of that are highly altered as well. Again, I've been sampling out there since our systematic sampling since 1980. We've caught thousands of fish in the process. And by the way, if anybody ever wants to go out with us, we take volunteers. Go out every month. Just email me and I'll get you on our email list. But this is what the major fish fauna looks like. Everything with an A on it is an alien species, a non-native species. And the others are native species. I had these arranged according to how they use the habitat. Bottom fishes down the bottom, fishes that use the edge habitat over here, midwater fishes over there, surface-oriented fishes on the top. If you were a biologist and did not know anything about fish, one thing you would, and did not know which were native and which were not native, you would look at this picture and say, wow, this is clearly a co-evolved assemblage of fish. They're all morphologically very different from one another. They must have evolved together and figured out how to segregate the habitat and the niches and so forth. And they actually, in many respects, they behave that way. But this is a mixture of fish from all over the world. This goby down here is from Japan, for example. The carp is from Europe. The catfishes are from the eastern United States. So this is really a mixture of fish that did not evolve together. And yet, you can, when you study them, you get impressed by the fact they seem to behave that way. That gives you great hope, by the way, if you're into reconciliation ecology like I am. And one way you can see this is this is the native species are purple, the non-native species are the striped. This is the annual fluctuations in numbers. And one thing you notice that the native species don't fluctuate as much as the non-natives, but they do fluctuate in the same way. That tells you these fish are all responding to the environment in roughly the same way. But the other thing this slide shows is the constant invasion of new species coming into the system. And that obviously makes it more complicated. There's in recent years we've had the invasions by an overbite clam, which has had a major impact on the system. A Shokahazi goby, which is not, now a Siberian prawn, which has replaced the bay shrimp in the system. But you also notice that blue line up there. There's big salinity control gates installed by the Department of Water Resources that regulate the salinity of the marsh. So this is a system we're manipulating. And it's a system that seems to work in many respects, but we are in charge, and the various things we do to it make a big difference in terms of whether the natives or non-natives are dominant. We also have this basic issue of how do we reconcile climate change and sea level rise with the management of the marsh. And if you really want to read about this, is a book I published last year on the Sioux City Marsh, on its ecological history and possible futures. It's a great place to try to figure these things out because it's so big and it has so much potential for working that way. Some of our key findings that we find that, first off, it's a highly managed novel ecosystem. You know, there's 151 duck clubs on the marsh. Each one manages their own duck clubs independently of other duck clubs. There's some coordination, but not as much as you'd think. But the water management that they do benefits both fish and ducks. We've been studying in recent years, really find out that a lot of the duck management actually turns out to be better for fish than we thought it was. So the duck clubs and fish can be compatible, especially if you can change management of some of the duck clubs in various ways. But this marsh protects the city. Protects the cities from a lot of things. It's this huge expansive marsh that the tides can rise over, and storm surges will get muted by having that massive marsh there. So reconciliation is a really good strategy to be thinking of in terms of how do you manage this marsh in the future, because it's going to change. California is going to be changing and very rapidly in the next 50 to 100 years. And this is a great place to put some of these principles to work. And in our book, I've created a bunch of scenarios, but this is one example of a reconciled marsh where you maintain the center of Sioux City Marsh pretty much as it is today, as a managed marsh primarily for duck hunting. But then you create various corridors and so forth where you're really managing for native species. You manage them very intensively for native fish, for native waterfowl, for anything else that you think is important out there. And this also shows you the kind of things you have to live with in a place like this. That one straight line where it says estuarine gradient, that's the railroad. When you take Amtrak to San Francisco, you're going through the marsh. That's where you're going through the marsh. That's one of the most expensive sections of track in the whole western U.S.